They didn't just kill you. They broke you. The Vikings turned sex into a weapon, shame into a public execution, and the body into an altar for their gods. Captives were stripped and bound before entire villages, forced into rituals so brutal that even their own sagas erased them. These weren't crimes, they were celebrated as holy acts of power. For centuries, this truth was buried, first by the church, then by the very historians who claimed to honor Viking history. But the earth has given it back, and what it reveals will change everything you think you know. The Vikings you think you know never existed. The clean, heroic warriors of TV dramas, brave explorers with strict honor codes, are a modern invention, shaped by centuries of storytelling that shaved away the truth. In reality, the Norse world was a brutal hierarchy, where power was measured not only in how many men you could kill, but in how completely you could own another person's body and soul. To be conquered by a Viking was not just to lose your home, but to lose your identity. And the tools of that domination weren't always swords and axes. Sometimes, they were far more intimate. Why have we spent centuries sanitizing their most depraved rituals? The answer lies in who wrote the history. By the time most Viking sagas were committed to parchment, Christian scribes were in control. They preserved the violence of the battlefield, but scrubbed away the violence of the bedchamber. What remains are hints, odd phrases, insults too crude to translate. Half-erased passages in sagas that point to a truth much darker than the myths. Archaeology fills in the gaps. Burial sites reveal goods and symbols that suggest sexual power was both a private obsession and a public display. Items meant for humiliation, charms invoking fertility in ways we'd now call obscene, and, most tellingly, the remains of people who appear to have died in rituals that blurred the line between offering and abuse. To understand what the Vikings really did behind closed doors, we need to go inside the longhouse, where the smell of wood smoke and mead mixed with sweat, blood, and fear. Here, pleasure and pain were the same thing, and dominance was a form of worship. And in this world, the line between the sacred and the depraved didn't just blur, it disappeared entirely. Vikings didn't just fight with blades and shields. They fought with shame. In Norse culture, humiliation was more than an insult, it was a kind of death. And the most devastating humiliations were sexual. In a society where masculinity and honor were everything, to be labeled agra, unmanly, was the ultimate destruction. That word didn't mean weak or cowardly. It meant sexually submissive. It meant your body had been used as a weapon against your own status. Why did this matter so much? Because, in the Viking worldview, dominance was divine. The gods themselves, Odin, Thor, Freyr, were imagined as conquerors not only of worlds but of bodies. A man who could dominate another in any way was closer to the gods. A man who allowed himself to be dominated was stripped of his humanity. Sexual power was political power, and it could topple chiefs just as easily as a sword through the gut. The sagas hide this in insults. In Lokasenna, Loki accuses Odin of practicing seidr, a form of magic considered shameful because it required the passive role in certain sexual rites. In Egil's saga, an enemy is mocked with a carved figure that depicts him in a sexual position meant to strip him of all authority. To be accused of such things in public was to be ruined, sometimes even legally killed for dishonor. But humiliation didn't stop at words or carvings. Captives taken in raids might be paraded before a community, forced into acts meant to display their total defeat. This wasn't just cruelty for cruelty's sake, it was a warning to anyone thinking of rebellion. Your body wasn't yours. It could be turned into a message. And the most chilling part? These acts could happen between Vikings themselves. A defeated rival within the same clan might be subjected to sexual humiliation in front of his own warriors, ensuring he could never reclaim his place. The Norse legal codes, written centuries later under Christian influence, still hint at this, with laws prescribing brutal punishments for those who used sexual accusations as political weapons, proof that the practice was once common enough to threaten the stability of entire communities. Archaeology supports this darker reading. Excavations in Scandinavia have uncovered ritual objects, phallic amulets, carved figures in explicit poses, bindings designed for restraint that appear not only in grave goods but in communal feasting halls. These weren't hidden tools of private vice. They were part of the public, performative life of the settlement. They sent a message: the chief controls pleasure and pain, and therefore, he controls you. Why did this form of power endure? Because it worked. In a culture that valued strength above all, to turn an enemy into the opposite of what the society revered was the ultimate conquest. It robbed them not only of dignity, but of their place in the social order. No blade could do that as completely as shame could. And shame in Viking culture could kill. The sagas tell of men who, after being accused of unmanliness or suffering sexual humiliation, chose to die rather than live under that shadow. Sometimes they sought death in battle. Sometimes they simply walked into the sea. But some humiliations didn't just end reputations. They ended lives in far more violent ways. Because when the Vikings took their sexual power beyond humiliation and into outright ritualized violence, the result was something closer to human sacrifice than simple domination. And on the coasts of Europe, in the dark hours after a raid, these acts became part of a weaponized ritual that left no survivors, only warnings carved into the memories of those who heard the screams. This was ritual rape in warfare, and it was as much a part of the Viking arsenal as their battle axes. When a Viking raid ended, the real horror often began. The images we carry from sagas and modern dramas, smoke rising from burning halls, treasure spilling from longships, are only half the truth. The other half is what the Vikings did with the living. The Norse saw war not only as conquest, but as harvest. Gold, silver, livestock, and human bodies were all spoils to be divided, but unlike animals or goods, human captives could be used to send messages. And in the Viking mind, there was no clearer message than turning an enemy's warriors, their families, even their leaders, into symbols of defeat through sexual violence. Why was this ritualized? Because in Norse belief, victory was not simply about killing, it was about total domination, to control the enemy's body, to make them serve your will, even in humiliation, was a form of spiritual conquest. A warrior who had been sexually violated was considered stripped of his honor, and by extension, his family and clan lost face. The shame clung for generations. The sagas speak of it only in code. In Sturlunga Saga, an enemy chief is treated like a mare after being captured, a phrase modern scholars recognize as an allusion to sexual assault meant to destroy his reputation. In Landnámabók, there is a cryptic reference to night play forced upon captives before they were ransomed back to their kin. These accounts were softened by Christian scribes, but the implication is clear. These were acts of political warfare, not private cruelty. Archaeology adds weight to the stories. Mass graves in Ireland and Scotland show signs of blunt trauma combined with pelvic injuries, suggesting post-capture assaults before execution. In one infamous burial pit in Orkney, the remains of both men and women show patterns consistent with violent restraint and abuse. The victims were stripped, marked, and displayed before death, likely as part of the same ritual humiliation seen in the sagas. And there was a performative aspect. The acts were often public, witnessed not only by the victors but by other captives, sometimes by the survivors who would be allowed to return home. Those survivors became living warnings. Imagine returning to your village with the memory of your chief bound, mocked, and violated before being cut down. The psychological warfare was devastating. It wasn't just foreigners who suffered. Within the Viking world, ritual sexual violence could be turned inward. If a warband returned with prisoners taken from rival Norse settlements, those prisoners might face the same public humiliation as foreign captives. This blurring of lines between internal feud and external war made Viking politics dangerously personal. The use of sexual violence as a form of prophecy is hinted at in certain accounts. Some captives were taken to Cirrus's volur before execution, their abuse tied to divination rites. The logic was twisted. In breaking the victim, the Vikings believed they could break the will of their enemies, and At the same time, please or consult the gods. The screams were not just a byproduct, they were an offering. How did the Vikings justify this brutality? To them, it wasn't a crime, it was a demonstration of dominance, strength, and divine favor. A raider who brought home captives in this way proved not only his skill in battle, but his power to humiliate. In a world where power was everything, such a display could make a man untouchable among his peers. But there was a darker layer still. Some captives weren't killed after their humiliation. They were kept, paraded in chains during feasts, forced to serve as living reminders of a victory. These shame slaves could live months or years in this state, never allowed to escape the role imposed upon them. In a culture obsessed with honor, it was a living death. The Christian chroniclers who eventually wrote about Viking raids monks in Britain, Francia, and Ireland were horrified enough to preserve hints of these acts even in heavily censored texts. One Irish annal describes cruel indignities visited upon noblewomen during the sack of Armagh in 890 CE, with the note that the victims were given to the ships like plunder. The phrase is telling women and men both could be treated as goods, used, and discarded. Why does this matter today? Because the sanitized image of the Vikings as rough but noble explorers erases the reality of a culture that weaponized sexuality as deliberately as it wielded steel. Understanding this isn't about shock value, it's about restoring the truth to a history that has been filtered through centuries of romanticization. And if you think this violence was confined to the battlefield, think again. Some of the most disturbing sexual acts of the Viking Age didn't happen in the chaos of a raid, they happened in the heart of their own sacred festivals. And they weren't crimes. They were offerings, welcome to the blot of flesh. The Vikings didn't separate their gods from their appetites. To them, pleasure and pain were both forms of worship, and some of the most sacred rites blurred the line so completely that outsiders could barely tell where religion ended and cruelty began. These were the bloat sacrificial festivals meant to honor the gods with offerings of food, drink, animals, and sometimes human beings. We imagine sacrifice as solemn chants in the torchlight, a single, clean stroke of a blade. But some blots were anything but clean. Certain festivals to Freya, the god of fertility, and his sister Freya, goddess of love and desire, were celebrated with acts that modern eyes would call obscene. To the Vikings, they were divine reenactments of the powers that kept the world alive. The fertility of the fields, the success of the harvest, the very survival of the clan, all were tied to these rites. And in those rites, sex was not only symbolic, it was literal. Why would a warrior culture sanctify something so carnal? Because in their belief, the gods themselves engaged in lust, rivalry, and passion. To please them was to mirror them. And mirroring them could mean public sexual acts in the heart of the feast, sometimes with partners chosen by lot, sometimes with captives brought in from raids. These captives were not participants, they were offerings. The accounts are fragmentary, but hints remain in sagas and in the shocked writings of Christian observers. Adam of Bremen, an 11th century chronicler, described a great temple at Uppsala where 9 of every living thing were sacrificed: men, animals, even birds. Archaeology has confirmed the mass burials, but alongside the butchered bones, excavators have found restraints, phallic carvings, and fertility idols smeared with what chemical analysis suggests was both blood and semen. It wasn't just about the act itself, it was about the theater. In some fertility bloats, the sacrifice was preceded by ritualized humiliation. Captives might be stripped, painted, and made to perform lewd gestures in front of the gathered crowd. Women could be forced to bless the fields through public acts meant to symbolize the sowing of seed. Men might be bound in postures meant to invoke submission before being killed. Every movement, every cry, was part of the offering. In the most extreme rites, the moment of death was synchronized with the moment of sexual climax, believed to unite life's greatest creative force with its ultimate end. This was considered the height of a gift to the gods. In these moments, the boundaries between worship, violence, and violation completely vanished. The political function was just as important as the religious one. A chieftain who presided over a blot of flesh proved not only his piety, but his power over life, death, and desire. Participation was mandatory for those chosen. Refusal wasn't an option unless you wanted to be the next one, bound to the altar. What did the participants believe they were accomplishing? In their minds, they were ensuring that Freya's blessings would fall upon the land, that the seas would give up their fish, that the wombs of women and livestock alike would be fruitful. Failure to perform the rites correctly could mean famine, plague, or defeat in war. That fear kept the cycle going. The psychological effect on the community was profound. Children grew up seeing these acts as sacred. The victims, whether local outcasts or foreign captives, became symbols, not people. By the time Christianity arrived in Scandinavia, these rituals were so deeply woven into cultural life that missionaries often had to physically destroy the sites of sacrifice before the practices would stop. Even then, some continued in secret. Modern scholars still debate just how widespread the sexual elements of the bloat were. But the combination of archaeological finds, coded saga references, and outside reports paints a picture that is hard to ignore. The Vikings didn't simply celebrate fertility, they weaponized it, turned it into a spectacle of power that bound the community in complicity. And not all sacrifices were about the harvest. Some were about something far more dangerous. In certain cases, sexual rites were performed not for the sake of the land or the clan, but for prophecy. The belief was that the gods could be persuaded to reveal the future if they were given the right kind of offering, and sometimes that offering had to be taken from a living, breathing victim in a ritual that blurred pleasure, pain, and death into one. And that's where the vulva came in, the seeress whose visions could change the fate of kingdoms. But to see the future, she demanded a price in flesh, in submission, and sometimes in life itself. What happened in those prophecy rites was whispered about even among the Vikings, and it was feared for good reason. They called her the vulva, the staff-bearer, the woman who could braid time. Villagers waited for her as winter closed in, leaving gifts outside the longhouse door. A cloak stitched with silver thread, a bowl of fat-rich stew, a polished staff with runes carved so deep the wood seemed to bleed. Yet everyone kept a careful distance, because when the vulva arrived, nothing stayed hidden. Not your fears, not your secrets, and certainly not your body. Why did prophecy demand a price? In Norse belief, knowledge wasn't free. It was wrestled from the world like a prize taken in battle. Odin himself paid by hanging on Yggdrasil, pierced by his own spear. If a god had to suffer to gain wisdom, what hope did mortals have of bargaining gently? The answer was simple. They didn't. Rites of sight Seither took something from those involved, and the taking was intimate. Power was drawn through submission, status reversed and rearranged. Boundaries crossed that left reputations trembling. The setting was theatre and trap. Benches dragged inward, torches lowered until the rafters sweated pitch. A ring of women formed around the vulva, her choir, her shield. Drums began, slow and hollow. The smell of herbs, angelica, henbane thickened the air. Boys and men who would never admit fear stared at the packed earth and swore their guts weren't turning to ice. The vulva's staff struck the floor once, twice, and the longhouse became a lung, breathing with the chant. What did she ask for? Sometimes livestock, sometimes silver, often obedience. The more desperate the petition, the more precise her demands. A failing chieftain pleading for a safer sea lane might be ordered to surrender symbols of rank, to sit below the hearthline like a servant while she spoke. A warrior, terrified of winter famine, might be told to endure humiliation before his kin, as proof he prized their survival above his pride. These were not mere gestures. In a culture where honor was a currency, the vulva could bankrupt a man without touching his coin. And yet, there are darker hints. The language surrounding Seither spills into the charged vocabulary of ergi unmanliness, shame, the reversal of proper order. Loki's taunts in Lokasenna come back like a knife. Odin practiced Seith, like a witch, a stain that words alone could not wash away. Why would Seither provoke such venom? Because it threatened the hierarchy from inside. Prophecy required boundary-breaking ritual actions that placed the seeker in a passive role before a woman wielding sacred power. For some, that inversion alone was blasphemy. For others, it was the point. Archaeology offers fragments that sharpen the silhouette. Burials of seeresses from Fyrkat in Denmark to Birka in Sweden yield staffs, amulets, and pouches of narcotic seeds. At Oseberg, the ship grave many believe held a ritual leader. Textiles and carved animals suggest processions and performances as layered as court pageantry. None of this tells us exactly what happened in the tight circle of a working seether, but it warns us this was not a quiet prayer. It was a choreography, and as with the bloat, bodies were instruments in that score. The humiliation practiced here had a purpose. A chieftain who submitted himself to the rite demonstrated to his people that he would sacrifice pride to secure their future, yet the spectacle cost him. Rivals could whisper. He bent his head to a witch. Allies could ask, if he yields in the longhouse, will he yield in the field? The vulva's power, then, was double-edged. She could save a winter and end a career. That was why some leaders tried to control the rites, limiting who could watch, forcing oaths of silence, or commissioning private ceremonies away from prying eyes. Power hates witnesses. Seither demanded them. What of those chosen to assist young singers, cupbearers, the ones who warmed the vulva with cloaks when trance left her shaking? They bore marks too. To serve closely in a rite aligned your fate with hers. You became part of an economy of favors, fears, and obligations. A mother might urge her daughter to join, hoping for better matches and safer births. A father might forbid his son from standing anywhere near the circle, terrified an accusation of urgy would cling to him like smoke. The rite made and unmade families. Then there were the petitioners who came not for weather or war, but for private vengeance. Tell me how to break him. Tell me how to bind her tongue. Seither could turn petty cruelty into sacred order, all while claiming divine sanction. And if the vulva saw danger in her vision, if she named a traitor, called a famine by its secret cause, or announced that the gods required a heavier gift, the longhouse could turn. The same crowd that had honored her might suddenly notice the foreign cloth on her shoulders, the odd ring from across the sea, the way her eyes stayed open too long in trance. Fear curdled into blame. Prophecy changed the rules in another way. It converted desire into destiny. If the vulva declared a union necessary for the luck of the farm, what began as compulsion could be dressed in the cloak of community need. Who would refuse, with everyone watching? Who would argue with the gods when seed and summit lay in the balance? This is where power and intimacy fused into something difficult to name and even harder to resist. The rite could sanctify what would otherwise be condemned, and that sanctification left scars no court could remedy. Did all vulva demand these costs? No. The record is varied, the practices local, the evidence incomplete. Many likely worked with herbs and song, with staff and story, causing no harm beyond pride and purse. But in times of fear, crop blight, failed raids, rivals at the border rituals harden. Communities reach for the sharpest tools they have. And in the Viking age, seether could become a blade without anyone touching steel. Consider a composite winter one pulled from scattered testimonies and the archaeology of dread. Snow already heavy in late autumn, cattle thin, a ship due home that has not been seen. The vulva is asked to speak. She requires the chieftain to lay down his sword, then his armband, then his seat by the hearth. She marks his brow with ash, sets her staff to the floor, and sings. The circle tightens. The chant lifts. Someone weeps. Someone laughs too loudly. When the trance breaks, she says what the room already fears. The ship lies under ice, and the spring will be cruel. To soften the blow, she names a price that can throttle gossip. Gifts to the shrine. A marriage ratified. A rival's boast answered with a public apology. And yes, an act of submission. For the luck of the fields. She doesn't name it aloud. She doesn't need to. The crowd understands the shape of the thing she has placed between them. What happens next is memory and myth. Some claim the spring truly was kinder after such rites. Others insist the bargain only postponed disaster. But everyone remembers who bent, who stood, who held the vulva's cloak, who refused to meet her eyes. Sather was information weaponized. Once spoken, it could not be unsaid. Once enacted, it could not be unwitnessed. And when Christianity pressed into the north, this was the knot missionaries tried hardest to cut. They condemned the crossings, the gender inversions, the ritual humiliations, the charged theater of obedience as demonic. Many vulvur were driven out, some killed, others absorbed into new roles as cunning women working in the margins. The rites didn't disappear overnight. They went quiet, went private, went underground. But they left a fossil in the culture, a memory that, for a price, the future could be bought, and that the coin was often your standing, your body, your name. The silencing that followed did more than end rites, it rewrote the past. As crosses rose where staffs once struck earth, sagas were smoothed, terms blurred, and shame rebranded as sin. The Viking world didn't stop using power. It changed the words for it. Christianity didn't just arrive in the north, it advanced like a tide. Slow at first, then swelling until it swallowed the shore. Missionaries didn't meet the Viking world with swords alone. They brought a new vocabulary for power, sin, and salvation. And they had a strategy. If you can't erase a practice, rename it. If you can't destroy a story, rewrite it. That was how the most disturbing sexual rituals of the Viking Age began to vanish, not through instant prohibition, but through years of deliberate forgetting. The first step was claiming the moral high ground. Christian chroniclers described Viking rites in ways that made them sound barbaric, even when those same chroniclers ignored similar practices in their own courts and monasteries. Sexual humiliation became heathen obscenity. Fertility sacrifices became pagan debauchery. The vulva's trance was labeled sorcery. Her demands for submission reframed as devil's work. In the new faith's lexicon, these weren't acts of worship, they were proof of damnation. Then came the physical erasure. Temples were torn down or converted to churches, their sacred posts burned, their altars buried under stone. Sacred groves were cut and cleared, their stumps used for firewood. The long houses that once held blots were stripped of carvings and replaced with crucifixes. Without the spaces to host them, the old rituals fractured. Some were moved to the edges of settlements, others hidden entirely. The public theater of sexual power and humiliation became a whisper behind closed doors. But silence doesn't erase memory, it distorts it. The sagas we read today were written generations after the conversion, often by men educated in Christian monasteries. They kept the battles, the voyages, the feasts, but sanded away the raw edges of the old rites. Sexual violence, once wielded openly as a political and religious tool, was reduced to vague insults, coded references, or omitted entirely. When humiliation rituals appear in the texts, they are usually presented as aberrations, the acts of villains or foreigners, not something woven into the fabric of Norse power. Yet traces remained, stubborn as frost in the shade. Oral traditions carried hints of the old ways, songs half remembered, riddles whose answers made elders glance over their shoulders, place names that clung to Freya or Freya despite church decrees. Archaeology preserved the harder evidence, bindings, amulets, carved figures that didn't fit the neat moral world the church tried to impose. These relics are the ghost script of the Viking Age, waiting for someone to read them without flinching. The forgetting wasn't only cultural, it was personal. Those who had participated in the old rites had to choose, deny their own history, or risk exile and execution. Some converted publicly and kept old habits in secret, cloaking them in the language of the new faith. Others severed themselves from their past entirely, refusing to speak of it even to their children. The result was a generational break. Knowledge that had passed through centuries was suddenly locked away in silence. This silence worked for the new rulers. By cutting the thread between past and present, they ensured the old ways could never be fully restored. And over time, that silence hardened into myth. The Vikings became what the church needed them to be. Fierce warriors, yes, but also sinners redeemed, their barbarism safely contained in a conquered past. But the erasure was never perfect. A carved figure found in a farmstead midden. a saga line that doesn't quite match the moral tone of its chapter. A grave that holds not a warrior's sword, but a vulva's staff and a pouch of strange seeds. These fragments tell us the old world didn't disappear, it was buried, and like anything buried in the north, it waits for thaw. Centuries later, when scholars began to dig for that buried past, they didn't expect what they would find. The shock didn't just come from the artifacts themselves, but from the realization that their own predecessors had hidden them. The age of the Christian scribe had ended. The age of the Victorian cover-up had begun. When the first wave of serious archaeology swept through Scandinavia in the 19th century, the story of the Vikings was ready to be reborn. Steamships carried scholars up fjords, spades cut into burial mounds, and the old sagas were pulled from dusty shelves to be translated for eager European audiences. It should have been the perfect moment for the truth to re-emerge, the moment when the darker, stranger details of Viking life would finally see daylight. But that isn't what happened. Instead, another layer of silence was laid over the past, this time not by priests, but by academics in waistcoats and stiff collars. The Victorians had a vision of the Vikings that suited their own tastes. They wanted rugged explorers, fearless traders, and noble warriors figures who could serve as symbols of national pride for Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and beyond. They did not want to find evidence of sexual humiliation rituals, fertility bloats involving captives, or prophecy rites that reversed the power of kings. And so, when the ground yielded artifacts that didn't fit the image, those artifacts quietly disappeared into restricted collections, or were written off as curiosities too indecent for public display. The methods of concealment varied. Some were simply locked away. A carved wooden idol from a Swedish farmstead, explicit in a way that left no doubt about its use, was kept in a museum drawer for nearly a century before being catalogued. Other finds were destroyed outright. In Norway, a set of phallic-shaped amber amulets found in a ship burial were misplaced during transport to a university archive. Records show they existed, but no one can say where they went. Some archaeologists were open about their choices. One Danish antiquarian wrote in his field notes, "Such things cannot be shown to the public without damaging the dignity of our history." It wasn't only artifacts that were censored, texts were altered too. Early translators of the sagas smoothed over insults related to sexual passivity, omitting them entirely or substituting harmless phrases. A line from Erbygja saga that implied a man had been forced into a sexual role as a punishment was rephrased to suggest he had merely been mocked for weakness. The meaning was gutted, and with it, the reader's understanding of how deeply entwined sexual dominance was with Viking concepts of honor. Museums developed elaborate systems for hiding problematic material. In Stockholm, certain rune stones with overtly sexual imagery were displayed with the relevant sections turned toward the wall or covered by plaques. In Copenhagen, an entire storage area in the National Museum became informally known among curators as Det skjulte kammer, the hidden room, where explicit finds were locked away from anyone without professional clearance. Even then, access was often denied to scholars who asked too many questions. Why this second cover-up? In part, it was morality. The Victorian world, with its rigid public codes and unspoken private vices, could not stomach the idea that its cultural ancestors might have practiced open, ritualized sexuality, especially when those acts involved violence or children. But it was also nationalism. The newly forming Scandinavian states wanted heroes, not monsters. The darker truths of the Viking Age would have undermined the clean, proud image being built for public consumption. This selective history shaped generations of understanding. Schoolchildren learned about Leif Erikson discovering Vinland, about Harold Bluetooth uniting Denmark, but they never learned about the blot of flesh or the humiliation rites woven into law and custom. Even the word Viking became detached from the full reality, turned into a romantic archetype that bore little resemblance to the flesh and blood people beneath the hornless helmets. The irony is that the silenced evidence was often the most revealing. A set of restraints found alongside a fertility idol could have told us how public and physical these rites were. A saga passage left unaltered could have shown how deeply shame was weaponized. Instead, those pieces were either hidden or presented without context, stripping them of their power to challenge the modern myth. By the late 20th century, some cracks began to appear in the wall. Younger archaeologists, less bound by Victorian morals, started publishing studies on the sexual symbolism of Viking artifacts, on the coded language in the sagas, on the forensic evidence in certain graves. What they found matched, and in some cases exceeded, the darker hints preserved in medieval texts. The old image of the Viking as nothing more than a sea-roving warrior began to erode. Yet, even today, the cover-up's shadow lingers. Many artifacts remain in storage, their existence noted only in dry inventory lists. Some museums still refuse to photograph or display explicit finds. And the saga translations most people can easily read are often the same bowdlerized versions first printed over a century ago. The Viking Age we think we know is still, in large part, a Victorian invention, a past edited to protect the sensibilities of people long dead. But the soil doesn't lie. The ground remembers what the scribes and curators tried to forget. And with every dig, with every uncovered burial, the Viking world reveals itself again not just as raiders or traders, but as masters of a kind of power most people still can't bring themselves to speak of aloud.